On the fields of Hastings, the English fought with unbreakable courage. Their shield wall repelled wave after wave of Norman attacks, and victory seemed certain. But then, in a moment that no one expected, William made a move that turned triumph into disaster, and England would never be the same again. The morning of October 14, 1066, dawned cold and sharp upon the rolling hills of Sussex. A pale mist clung to the fields, curling around the hedgerows and dampening the grass beneath the feet of two armies who would soon decide the fate of a kingdom. On the high ground of Senlac Hill stood the Saxons of England, led by King Harold Godwinson. They were weary from their long march. Less than 3 weeks earlier, they had fought and bled at Stamford Bridge, crushing the Norwegians of Harald Hardrada. Many bore scars from that victory, their bandages still fresh, their limbs aching from the forced march south. Yet despite their exhaustion, their spirits were unbroken. This was their homeland, and they would defend it with their lives. At the crest of the hill, Harold stood tall in his mail, a heavy axe resting in his hand. Beside him rose the Dragon of Wessex, the ancient banner of his house, snapping proudly in the autumn wind. He turned to face his men, Huskarls with great axes, the iron core of his army, and Ferdmen, the levied farmers who filled the line with spear and shield. Men of England, he called, his voice carrying like a war horn. Here we make our stand. Before us lies the Norman usurper who dares to steal our crown. Fight not only for me, but for your wives, your children, your fields, and the graves of your fathers. Let no man call us cowards this day. A thunderous roar answered him. Shields were lifted, beaten in rhythm with spear hafts, until the sound rolled like storm clouds down the slope. The Saxon shield wall stretched across the hill, a living fortress of wood and iron. Below, upon the plain, the Normans assembled in disciplined order. Their ranks gleamed with polished mail, their knights upon restless horses, their archers stringing bows in anticipation. At their head rode Duke William of Normandy, visor lifted, his face grim and determined. He carried the papal banner gifted by Rome itself, declaring his cause righteous in the eyes of God. There lies England's crown, he told his captains. By right of oath and by God's blessing, it is ours. Today, we take it, or die. The horns of both armies sounded. Across the misty fields, arrows were notched, cavalry lowered their lances, infantry lifted their shields. The earth trembled as men prepared to kill and be killed. The Battle of Hastings had begun. The first Norman move came with a storm of arrows. At William's signal, his archers stepped forward, loosing their shafts in high arcs. The sky darkened for a heartbeat, then the rain of death hissed downward upon the Saxons. Yet the shield wall held. The Huskarls raised their heavy oaken shields, the Ferdmen crouched behind them, and the arrows clattered harmlessly against the wall of wood and iron. Some men fell, pierced through unguarded gaps, but the line did not waver. A rumble of laughter even rolled through parts of the English host. "Is this all the Normans can do?" one man shouted. Frustrated, William unleashed his infantry. Norman foot soldiers advanced in tight ranks, their shields up, their swords and spears gleaming in the morning sun. They trudged uphill, faces set with grim determination, shouting battle cries in Norman French. But the incline slowed them, and when they met the Saxon line, it was like waves crashing against a cliff. Spears thrust upward from behind the shield wall, axes came down with sickening force, splitting helmets and shattering shields. The English roared their defiance, driving the Normans back step by step. Then came the knights. The ground trembled as William's cavalry surged forward, lances lowered, horses snorting steam into the chill air. The sight was terrifying, armored men on massive destriers charging uphill with unstoppable momentum. But the Saxons braced themselves, shields locked, spears angled outward like the teeth of a giant beast. The impact was thunderous. Norman knights slammed into the Saxon wall, their lances splintering against shields, horses screaming as they met the wall of iron points. Riders toppled from their saddles, cut down by the long axes of the Huskarls. The hill itself seemed to groan beneath the weight of the clash, yet the line did not break. Time and again, the Normans pressed, and time and again, they were hurled back in blood and ruin. From above, the Saxons shouted jeers, their confidence growing. "England! England!" they cried, beating their weapons against their shields in rhythm. For a moment, it seemed Harold's men could withstand anything. Below, William watched, his jaw tight. His men were dying on the slope, and the Saxon wall seemed unbreakable. The day was slipping away from him, unless he found a way to turn the tide. And then fate offered him a moment of terror and opportunity. The morning dragged on, and the Norman assaults crashed again and again against the Saxon shield wall like surf against an immovable cliff. Arrows failed, infantry failed, even the mailed knights, pride of Normandy, failed. The slope of Senlac Hill was littered with broken shields, dying men, and riderless horses. The Saxons above jeered, their voices carrying in mocking waves, "Back to Normandy. You'll find no crown here." In the midst of this slaughter, disaster struck the invaders. A fierce counterattack by Harold's Huscarls surged down the slope, axes cleaving through Norman ranks. Men fell in droves, and as they staggered back, the line wavered. Somewhere in the chaos, a cry rose up, "The Duke is slain. William is dead." Panic spread like fire through dry grass. Soldiers looked around, terrified, their courage draining. Some began to flee downhill, pursued by Saxons emboldened by the rumor. Even seasoned knights hesitated, their discipline breaking as fear of leaderless ruin gripped them. For a moment, it seemed the battle was already lost, that the Normans would scatter across the field and be cut down piecemeal. But William still lived. His horse had been killed beneath him, throwing him violently to the ground. Bruised and bleeding, he seized another mount, fury burning in his chest. With reckless courage, he tore off his helmet so that all could see his face. His voice, raw but commanding, carried over the din. "I live. I live, by God's grace. Look at me, men of Normandy, I still lead, and I will lead you to England's crown." The sight of their duke alive rekindled Norman spirit. Trumpets blared as he rallied his knights, driving back the Saxons who had dared to descend the hill. Those who moments before had fled turned back, ashamed, falling in behind him. The panic gave way to grim determination, but William knew the truth: he could not win by brute force. The shield wall had held too strong. He needed cunning, not courage. And in his mind, a plan began to form, a trick that might yet pry open the fortress of Harold's line. The clash raged through midday, the sun climbing high as blood soaked the slopes of Senlac Hill. Time and again, the Norman charges crashed against the shield wall, and time and again, the Saxons hurled them back. Harold's men stood shoulder to shoulder, their shields scarred and their axes heavy with gore, yet their spirits soared. Each failed Norman assault convinced them more deeply that victory was within their grasp. William, however, had seen enough. He rode among his captains, his eyes sharp with resolve. "They will not break by strength," he said, voice low but fierce. "So we shall break them by guile." His words spread quickly through the ranks, and soon the signal was given. At the next assault, Norman cavalry and infantry pressed forward, clashing with the Saxon line in the same brutal rhythm as before. But this time, when the defenders pushed them back with jeers and roars, the Normans did not reform, they turned and fled downhill in apparent panic. Cries of triumph erupted from the English. "They run. The Normans break." Unable to resist, groups of Ferdmen and even some Huscarls surged down the slope in pursuit. They abandoned the safety of the shield wall, eager to cut down their retreating foes and finish the battle. Their boots thundered on the earth, their voices exultant, "Drive them into the sea. England is saved." But it was a trap. As the Saxons pursued, William wheeled his cavalry around with sudden precision. Trumpets blared, hooves pounded, and the fleeing Normans turned like wolves upon their hunters. The Saxons, scattered and disordered, were cut down mercilessly. Horses trampled men into the dirt, lances pierced unready bodies, swords carved through flesh and mail. Blood ran in streams as the pursuing Saxons realized too late the ruse that had snared them. From above, Harold watched in horror as precious ranks of his army were slaughtered in the open field. The shield wall, once seamless, now bore dangerous gaps. William smiled grimly from the saddle. The trick had worked once, and it could work again. The balance of the battle had begun to shift. The first feigned retreat had stunned the English, but Harold's men quickly tried to close ranks again. "Hold the wall," their captains shouted, dragging survivors back uphill, reforming shields against the slope. Yet the gaps were real, and William had seen the weakness. He struck again. Norman archers loosed a fresh storm of arrows, forcing the Saxons to lift their shields high. Then infantry advanced, pressing hard against the wall. As before, they seemed to falter under the Saxon axes and spears. And once more, a trumpet sounded, the Normans turned, fleeing in disorder down the hill. Shouts of victory filled the English ranks. The younger ferdmen, undisciplined and eager, believed the day already won. They poured forward in pursuit, streaming down the slope in waves. Some of Harold's Huscarls tried to hold them back, shouting warnings, "Stay in line. Do not break the wall." But excitement overcame caution. Down the hill they charged, and once again, William's cavalry wheeled around with devastating speed. Lances lowered, swords flashing, they fell upon the pursuers. The same cruel dance repeated, Saxons caught in the open, scattered and unprotected, hacked down mercilessly. Their cries of triumph turned to screams of terror, their blood soaking into the churned earth. 3 times William repeated the trick. Each time, more Saxons were lured out, more of the shield wall's strength drained away. Slowly, relentlessly, the proud line that had held since morning began to fray. Where once there had been a fortress, now there were gaps, small at first, then wider, until the Norman cavalry could strike through them like knives through cloth. From his hilltop, Harold saw the disaster unfolding. His corps of Huscarls still fought bravely, axes rising and falling in grim rhythm, but the ferdmen were breaking apart. The strength of his army, its unity, was unraveling before his eyes. Meanwhile, William rode among his men, his banner lifted high. "Press them," he cried. "England breaks, victory is at hand." And though the Saxons still roared defiance, the tide had turned. The shield wall, the soul of England's defense, was bleeding to pieces under the cunning of Normandy. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the blood-soaked field. For hours the Saxons had held, but the wall that once seemed unbreakable now sagged with exhaustion. Men bled from a dozen wounds, arms numbed by the weight of shields and axes. And yet they stood, roaring defiance with every breath left in their lungs. Then fate struck its cruelest blow. As Norman archers loosed another volley, one shaft flew high, arcing in the light of the sinking sun. It plunged into the Saxon line, and struck King Harold himself. Accounts differ, some said the arrow pierced his eye, others that Norman knights cut him down in the chaos, but all agreed on the result: Harold fell. For a heartbeat, the battle seemed to pause. Around the fallen king, his Huscarls gathered, fighting like madmen to defend his body. Axes rose and fell with desperate fury, hewing knights from their saddles, splitting shields, spilling blood in torrents. They knew they could not win, but they would not abandon their lord in death any more than in life. William seized the moment. Pointing his sword toward the hilltop, he bellowed, "There lies the false king. Strike him down, and England is ours." His cavalry surged forward in a final, thunderous charge. The gaps in the Saxon line yawned wide, and Norman knights poured through. Shield walls collapsed, ferdmen scattered, and the Huscarls were encircled. Still they fought, a circle of iron around Harold's fallen banner, until one by one they were cut down, axes falling silent in their bloodied hands. When the dragon of Wessex finally toppled, a great cry erupted from the Norman host. Trumpets blared, swords were raised, and the cry of "Normandy! Normandy!" rolled across the hill. The Saxon army, leaderless and broken, began to melt away. Some fled into the woods, some died where they stood, others dropped their arms in despair. The crown of England, fought for with such valor, now lay in the hands of the Conqueror. And as the last light of day faded, William knew, England was his. As the sun sank behind the hills of Sussex, the battlefield of Hastings lay silent but for the groans of the dying. Senlac Hill, once crowned with the proud shield wall of England, was now a graveyard. Broken shields lay scattered like fallen leaves, axes and spears snapped in half, the earth churned into mud and blood. Ravens circled overhead, already descending upon the fallen. The Saxons who survived stumbled into the woods, their eyes hollow, their voices broken. Some wept for their king, others cursed the Normans, but most walked in stunned silence, unable to comprehend the shattering of their world. Families in nearby villages watched the streams of fleeing men with dread, realizing the land they had called England for centuries now belonged to a foreign duke. Among the dead lay Harold Godwinson, last crowned king of the Saxons. His hussgirls had fought to the end around his body, and their corpses formed a grim ring of loyalty that told of their final stand. To the Normans, Harold's fall was proof of divine justice, to the English, it was the death of their freedom. Down the slope, the Norman camp erupted in celebration. Torches blazed, trumpets rang, and wine flowed as soldiers exulted in their triumph. But for William, victory was not sweet, it was cold, calculating. He walked the field by torchlight, his horse picking its way among the corpses. When he reached the place where Harold had fallen, he paused, staring at the broken banner of Wessex. "England lies here," he said quietly to his captains. "And tomorrow, we shall claim it in God's name." That night, the Normans prayed in their tents, giving thanks for victory. The English widows and children, meanwhile, lit candles in darkened homes, mourning the dead and fearing the future. The Battle of Hastings was over, but the conquest of England had only just begun. In the days after the battle, the field of Senlac remained heavy with death. English families crept from nearby villages to search among the corpses, hoping to find their husbands, brothers, and sons. Wails echoed across the hills as women uncovered familiar faces beneath blood and dirt. The dead were so many that they were buried in mass graves, heaped together beneath the soil without rites or honor. Only one man received special notice, Harold Godwinson, last king of the Saxons. His body was found mangled beyond recognition, pierced by arrow and blade, but his handfast wife, Edith Swan Neck, identified him by the marks upon his body only she could know. She wept over him, begging William for permission to bury Harold in the church he had founded at Waltham. William, wary of granting dignity to a rival, refused. Instead, Harold was laid to rest upon the cliffs of Hastings, so, as William is said to have remarked coldly, he might guard the shore he could not hold. For the English, his burial was not closure but despair. With Harold gone, the old line of Saxon kings was broken. Rumors spread that resistance would rally under Edgar Atheling, the young heir of royal blood, but few believed it could stand against Normandy's might. The people mourned not only a king, but the death of an age. Meanwhile, William wasted no time consolidating power. He marched his army slowly toward London, burning villages and crushing resistance along the way. His soldiers raised wooden fortresses as they advanced, symbols of Norman permanence. At every town, messengers proclaimed him the rightful king of England, sanctioned by God and the Pope. Fear preceded him. Some English lords bent the knee to spare their lands, others fled into hiding. In London, the nobles debated but saw no choice. With Harold dead and their armies shattered, they could not resist. The road to the throne lay open. And so, with winter approaching, William prepared for the final act, his coronation in the heart of his conquered enemy. On Christmas Day, 1066, the bells of London tolled as nobles, priests, and soldiers gathered within the half-finished abbey at Westminster. The air was thick with incense, but also with unease. England had been conquered, yet the land still smoldered with resentment. Saxon lords eyed the Normans with hatred, while Norman knights rested their hands upon their swords, expecting treachery at any moment. At the heart of the abbey stood Duke William of Normandy. His armor shone beneath the candlelight, his cloak of deep crimson lined with fur. Behind him fluttered the papal banner, proof of Rome's blessing upon his claim. The Archbishop Ealdred of York stepped forward, carrying the crown of Edward the Confessor, last Saxon Saint King. His voice rang out in solemn Latin as he asked the assembled nobles and clergy, "Do you accept William, Duke of Normandy, as your rightful king?" The Normans shouted their assent loudly, their voices echoing against the stone. The Saxons answered too, but with quieter, uncertain tones, compelled by fear as much as loyalty. Outside, soldiers heard the cries from within the abbey and, misunderstanding, believed a riot had broken out. In panic, they set fire to nearby houses, smoke curling into the sky even as prayers filled the church. Yet within the abbey, the ceremony continued. William knelt before the altar, swearing solemn oaths to protect the church and to rule with justice. Then the crown was lowered upon his brow, the crown of England, gleaming with gold and jewels. When he rose, now King William I, the Conqueror, the congregation bowed, some in reverence, others in bitterness. William's gaze swept the hall. He had won a kingdom by blood and cunning, but he knew it was not yet truly his. England simmered with rebellion, the north was restless, the Saxon people saw him as a foreign invader. Yet the crown was his, and no man in that moment could deny it. Outside, the flames spread, the smoke mingling with the tolling bells. It was an omen, some whispered, that William's reign, though glorious, would be born in fire and fear. And so, upon that winter day, the crown of England changed forever. The Battle of Hastings was not merely a clash of armies, it was the death of one world and the birth of another. With Harold slain and William crowned, the age of Saxon England ended, and a new Norman kingdom began to rise upon its ruins. For the common folk, the change came swiftly and harshly. Norman castles sprouted across the land like iron teeth, looming wooden towers that symbolized domination. Each stronghold was garrisoned by foreign knights who spoke a strange tongue and enforced the will of their Duke King. Fields were seized, villages burned at the faintest whisper of rebellion. Those who had once called themselves free men now bent beneath the yoke of new lords. For the Saxon nobility, the end was even more absolute. Harold's brothers had perished with him at Hastings, and most surviving thanes were stripped of their lands. William divided England among his Norman followers, companions who had crossed the sea with him, hungry for wealth and power. Where once the Earls of Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria ruled, now stood men with names foreign to English lips, Odo, Fitzosborne, de Warenne. The church too was remade. Norman bishops replaced Saxon clergy, and the Latin of Rome echoed louder than ever in English cathedrals. Even the language of the court began to shift. French became the tongue of rulers, while English was pushed down to the peasants, lingering only in hearths and fields. Yet William's conquest was not without resistance. In the north, uprisings flared, in the fens of Ely, Saxon rebels gathered around Hereward the Wake. The English spirit bent but did not wholly break. Still, the balance of power had shifted forever. When William ordered the great survey of his new kingdom, the Doomsday Book, 2 decades later, it recorded not only land and wealth, but the complete remaking of a nation. On the field of Hastings, beneath the broken banner of Wessex, England had been conquered. From that day forth, it would never again be the same. And so ended the saga of 1066, a year of blood, betrayal, and destiny, when the dragon of the Saxons fell, and the Lion of Normandy rose to rule.